You can't sell anything in retail without a barcode on it.
You can print barcodes just about anywhere.
Where is the line between black and white? And two different operators, one will have the bars, the average bar is 0.5 mil narrower than person 2, than person 3, than person 4. So you have this subjective, where is the edge, which you eliminate by building a machine and declaring that where it finds the edge is the edge.
This is the Automatic Identification Teachers Institute Virtual Edition, brought to you by the Material Handling Education Foundation, AIM, and the AIDC 100.
Well, I'm David L.A., and I've been in this industry for, 40 years. Who knows when to start counting? But my present company is Path Guide, and I started that 32 years ago.
My name is Mike Nolan, and I'm the founder and the current president of a 36-year-old AIDC company called AIS.
Sprague Ackley. I work for Digimarc Corporation.
How does a barcode actually work?
Hold up 5 fingers, and they're all about the same width. But suppose 2 of them were wider. I'll go back to my 2 of 5 and code 39 examples and say, okay, so first of all, a scanner, a traditional scanner, is either a wand, looks like a fat fountain pen with a light shining out the end, and you draw an imaginary line through the barcode. That's kind of where we started. And then laser scanners came along, and the laser could move a lot faster than your hand, and it could go back and forth both directions, but it's still drawing a line through the barcode. So today we have imagers. They take a picture of the barcode, and humongously powerful computers, about the size of your thumbnail, that go through all the calculations to make sense out of this area field that they see. Back in those days, computers were expensive, and microcomputers were on the verge of non-existent. Maybe they were non-existent, I guess. But anyway, so we're down at a level of simplicity. So I want to say, okay, if we have wide bars and narrow bars, and we have a spot of light and reflective light coming back and being collected, and the intensity. So now we've got a waveform that is, down on the dark, up on the light, going along. We have to figure out in there, okay, if here's a waveform. Now, you might think you go a white space, black, you're going to get a perfect square wave, like in the textbooks. This is a narrow one, this is a wide one. No, you don't get that, because paper and similar materials that you would print on actually have thickness, and they're kind of porous. And so when you have a black bar, it casts a shadow down into the paper. Now you say, well, how thick is the paper? 4 mils? Well, yeah, but your bars are only maybe 7 mils wide, and 4 mils is a lot. And so it's really important to figure out, as you go from dark to light, where along that path do you decide the edge is? I mean, it doesn't decide for you. So the first difficult thing about scanning barcode at the design level is, how do you figure out the transition point from dark to light and light to dark? And in between those two, you either have a light space or a dark bar. And so once you've done that, then you can say, well, you have a little counter running. It's counting microseconds or whatever it's counting in. And so, okay, so you've got a 10 wide space and a 42 wide bar and a 12 wide space and a 37 wide bar, et cetera, et cetera. And so you have to come up with, well, what is the rule I'm going to use to discriminate between wide bars and narrow bars? Well, in the day, we figured out what we were going to do and how we were going to do it. Now we have symbology standards that actually have a scanning section that kind of explains some of those things to the novice who is designing a reader. Not all the things, but some of the things. But where's the threshold from dark to light to dark is an interesting decision. Once you get the wides and narrows, then you have the counts, and then from the counts you can say, well, in code 39 you've got your 5 bars, and the width across all 5 is always the same. So as a percentage of this width, you can say, well, if it's less than this percentage, it's narrow. Greater than that percentage, it's wide. Here's my rule. It's just what I'm going to use. And each character can be analyzed separately, which is particularly important with a wand scanner that could speed up or slow down. You don't always have constant speed going through there.
Today, there's many new features, and you can add one big one, and that is that use of barcoding is actually a requirement. It was voluntary in price marking in early retail, but now it's a requirement that companies have to meet in the case that they want to participate in their industry. You can't sell anything in retail without a barcode on it.
The biggest reason that I've heard that people adopt AIDC in one form or another is that they were forced to. Way back in the early days, there were edicts, say by the Department of Defense and the auto industry, where basically they were told, you shall put a barcode label on this box. And what was nice after a while, after the complaining died down, was that these, thousands of little companies that put barcodes on for the big guys, DOD or some of the big automakers, they started to realize that, oh, hey, I can scan this barcode myself and use it in internal processes. And the biggest one right off the bat, of course, was inventory control. But then people started to use it for tracking time, and that started to spread wildly. That, along with what was going on in the industry, the standardization of some symbologies and standardizing of measuring print quality, all that somewhere in the 90s just caused an explosion of applications for the technology pretty much everywhere.
Why were you having to create barcode symbologies as you went?
Let's go back to the early 1970s. Okay, so pre-UPC, by a little bit pre-UPC, we had 2 of 5. I created interleaf 2 of 5 to solve a business problem so I could sell 3 printers. Our printers sold for $5,000 a piece, so this is $15,000 of revenue. I mean, it's worth it. But and so one day we had some guys from Boeing, the big airplane company that has all the problems now. Anyway, big Boeing and a little bitty Intermec, and they're around the conference table, and I'm explaining about this barcode and that, and Codabar and so forth, and UPC, and they said, well, here's the thing. Our part numbers have both letters and numbers in it. And yes, Codabar has a few, carefully chosen letters, usually for stop-start codes, but most of Codabar is digital. 205 and interleave 205 are all just 0 through 9. So I said, well, tell you what, we'll make a barcode for you. And I went up to the blackboard with a piece of chalk and I drew 5 bars. And nice thing about chalk, if you turn it sideways, you can draw a wide bar. So, so I said, well, we'll do 5 bars and 2 of them are wide, and 2 out of 5, that's 10 of them. And here's the spaces. I'm going to make 1 space wide. So 4 times 10 is 40. I'm going to save one of those for a stop-start code. So there's 39 characters. That'll take alphanumerics and a few symbols. And we didn't sell anything to Boeing, but I had a really, really smart, on-the-ball sales guy. Got on my nerves a little bit because sales guys are really pushy. But he went home and wrote out a code chart for code 39 that night and brought it back in. I says, well, no point wasting the work. That's going to be what, 0 through 9, A through Z. Here's the dash, here's a space, here's a period, blah, blah, blah. And that was the first 39 characters. And I created a barcode that now it's an alphanumeric barcode. We designed a print wheel for our printer and a program to print the stuff, modified our readers to read it. And Ray Stevens went out and started to sell it. So it was a necessity to keep the business moving forward.
Back in the 80s, there were no barcode standards. The first one really that I think made any type of an impact was what GS1 used to be called the Uniform Code Council, GS1 in the US anyway, and they famously developed a barcode symbol that was what is now on all cereal boxes. And of course, that was, oh, we have this standard and, you need to put it on your products. And all the grocers would say, hey, you guys, put it on your products. And they're like, well, why do I have to incur all this cost, But there was a critical mass required to make it worthwhile for the grocery guys to pay the money to put scanners in. And there was a lot of, kind of lurches and starts in the 70s getting that kind of system up and running. And I remember, one of my first forays into the public world was in the early 80s. And I gave a talk, about this new technology barcode. And God, there's like 500 people in the audience. And I kind of did a raise of hands. How many people have actually seen a barcode scanned? And it was only about a third, about 2/3 of the audience. And these are technically, interested people in the technology. They'd never been to a supermarket that was scanning barcodes because not many of them were. So I think the big takeaway from that to me is it takes a long time from when the standard, is, created and adopted. In that case, it was 1973, to when I gave my talk in the early 80s, that roughly 10 years later, people were aware of the barcode in supermarkets, but not everyone had actually seen it. And then I asked that question many times and pretty much stopped asking it maybe another 5 years later. By the late 80s, barcodes were on everything. All the supermarkets were scanning, and I would get maybe 1 or 2 hands that hadn't ever seen it. And so the new markets that are created by each symbology, when it's standardized to when it actually kind of gets everywhere, is around a 10 to 15 year process. And I think that's something that was always very interesting to me, and something that is we see today. So, for instance, today you ask a kid, I got a couple of kids, and my youngest is 15, and he He has his phone, and, he scans stuff if he needs to. But to him and to young people today, a barcode is a QR code. They don't even realize that they're scanning at the point of sale. They've just been watching things beep. I don't even know if they even know why, but they know about QR codes. And QR code is another interesting standard. So that came from Japan by a company named Denso. And in the early 1990s, they had developed this 2D symbology. There were one or two others at the time, but it required a camera to read it. And at that time, most barcodes were linear. They were read with a laser scanner. And these 2D barcodes required a camera. Of course, the 2D barcode famously holds a lot more data in a much smaller space. And that's really its big advantage. Plus, it has much better error checking and correction. So in the early days of linear barcodes, there was this occasional thing called the substitution error, which pretty much disappeared entirely with the advent of 2D barcodes. So the technology became very reliable, and Denso had this idea that they were going to, their 2D barcode was so good that people were going to pay to use it. And that ended up not being very successful. So they made the jump, and they put their barcode in a public standard that was developed by AIM. And anyone, they made a representation that it was free of all use restrictions, licenses, and fees, and anybody could print or read it according to the standard. And what can I say? Denso also promoted it relentlessly in Japan. And by the early 2000s, they had convinced all the cell phone manufacturers in Japan to add it as a native technology. So you could just aim your cell phone at a QR code, and it would read it. Of course, its big application was for going to this crazy new thing called the internet, and it would go to the internet automatically. And so it took, from when they first proposed this in the early 90s to about mid 2000s, so almost 15 years before it was widely adopted and became a commonplace thing in Japan. The rest of the world, of course, caught on in the 10 years following that. To me, you can print barcodes just about anywhere, and with direct part marking, you can make the barcode part of the material, which is, if you're going to mark a jet turbine blade, you're not going to be able to stick a label on that. So to me, I've always been intrigued with how you make the symbols. And as you are able to make barcodes in different ways, you're going to be able to use the barcodes in different ways. So the early barcodes were printed as part of packaging, and they were just all by themselves. Then in the early 90s, this thermal printer was invented, which allowed you to print barcodes on demand with any data that you want for a very reasonable price, with very, very good graphics, all computer controlled. And whereas barcode printing before that was very spotty and expensive and had limited formats and stuff. So the invention of the thermal printer, both thermal direct and thermal transfer, revolutionized the printing of barcodes. And that allowed printing barcodes, and sticking a label. And my God, we all, I don't know if everyone does it, but certainly at my house, we see boxes arriving at the door frequently, and they are just covered with barcodes, and those are all thermal labels. So that was gigantic, and you could mark bags of parts, You can mark, boxes and shipping containers. The whole supply chain application of barcode exploded with the invention of thermal printers, and then in the in the early 2000s and then into the teens, the direct part marking became huge. Another way to print, which is hammering dots into metal or etching metal away with lasers. That is the biggest growing segment of barcoding right now.
And I'd be curious to hear your side and your point of view on that development of the verifier that Sprague had over multiple years and lots of money put together finally.
Yeah. Well, okay. If I go back a little before that, for background, about once or twice a year, one of 2 or 3 companies that manufactured what they called verifiers would want to call on Intermec and sell us a verifier, so we could figure out whether barcode's good or bad. Well, typically, they would bring their machine into the conference room and take your time, set it up, and let me know when you get it all tweaked up and you're happy with it and everything. And so they would let me know, and I would typically bring in my own barcode and say, okay, let's verify this. And so the machines weren't very fast, but they would, it would work its way through the barcode. And it was kind of pre-computer, because what would happen is there'd be about a 3-inch wide strip of paper that was kind of like electrolytic shiny paper that was like a high-speed process, sort of burning numbers into this thing. And it would be, a series of numbers for bar and space widths, or edges and space widths that would come crawling out of this machine. And this would be the bar and space widths, or the edge to edge measurements, whichever you're looking for in here. So we'd get this, and I'd say, okay, now don't touch anything. Make it do it again. Nothing moves. Out would come again. Well, measurements would change as much as 1,000th of an inch, one reading to the next. And if you're talking about bars and spaces of 7 to 10 mils wide or so, maybe you have a tolerance of 1.5 mils plus or minus. And now this thing is inconsistent within 1,000th of an inch. So, how can you claim the barcode is in or out of spec if your device is that inaccurate? Oh, well, it's been banging around in the trunk of my car and blah, blah, blah. Fine. Bring it back when it's all fixed. And so I went through that about 3 or 4 times. Sprague was hired by Intermec Manufacturing as a physicist, which is unusual, but that's his degree, is in physics. And in those days, okay, I'm going to bring you one visual, just one visual. But this is a print wheel off of an Intermec mechanical printer. And the wheel was driven at constant speed, about 500 RPM. And then we had a electromagnetic hammer there's the little holes in the bottom. I don't think you can see them on this. Yeah, you can there.
Yep, we can see them.
So we had a photo eye through the little holes, which were made to be precise with respect to the bars up above. The bars are up here. And the hammer goes out and blam, we pick off the character on the fly. That's the way we're doing barcode printing. So from time to time, one of our customers would buy one of these verifiers that we wouldn't buy because they weren't accurate. And then they would send us a message that said they verified our Intermec printed barcode and it was out of specification. And I would say, does it scan well? Oh, it scans fine, but it's out of specification. Well, that was really irritating. Why do you care? It scans. particularly with UPC, we ran right on the edge of the tolerance, sometimes out, sometimes in. A barcode like Codabar or Code 39, you've got 4 bars for Codabar, 5 for Code 39, and the hammer goes out and it prints a whole character all at once. The white space between the characters can be a little sloppy. That's when we would advance the label from that position to the next position, and that was not nearly as accurate as the images engraved on the wheel. So the in-between spaces were sloppy. With UPC, the in-between space is part of the code. It's a continuous barcode. The space is part of the character. And even though the space itself is not highly toleranced, the overall length of the character is toleranced. And therefore the patterns within it in proportion, have a problem. So it was really irritating. So Sprague's first problem was to reinforce the manufacturing method and really document how to make one of these wheels, and particularly how to make the accurate engraved image repeatedly. And it was, it was basically, it was one of those things where the guy develops the skill to do it. And he was a funny old guy. He'd come in on the weekends and make print bins, but he tended to drink a lot. So they weren't always made right. We make a batch of 100. Sometimes we'd get 60 good ones. Sometimes we'd get 3 good ones or no good ones. You never knew. With Sprague's process, he documented every stage. We're getting 90 plus yield on every run. So the manufacturing manager, Larry, came to me and he said, we got this really bright guy. He solved our hardest problem. We don't have any other problem in manufacturing that's anywhere near that interesting for him. I don't know what to do with him. I said, well, why don't you assign him to me as my personal technical assistant? So that was Sprague. So I said, okay, Sprague, here's the background on verification. I want you to create a machine that will measure. We didn't know about verification yet. That will accurately measure the bar and space widths of a printed barcode and do it repeatedly, the same. Well, that started off this project. It was a 2-year project. And, a little bit of vibration can make a lot of difference in you're measuring, a 1/10 of a 1,000th of an inch here and there. That a little vibration is bad. So he got a 50-gallon drum full of water. Okay, well, there's 450 pounds, whatever it is, round numbers, 500, I don't know what it is. It's heavy. So it doesn't jitter around much. And on the top of that, he took I forget, 1.5 to 2 inch thick chunk of steel as the base for his verifier, and mounted the optics and everything. And then of course the output of that was input to what had just started to be available called a personal computer, one of the early IBM PCs. And so he had to do all the electronics that would amplify this signal and get it into the PC as a matter of 20 counts on black and 42 counts on white and this and that. We went through the whole issue of how to detect an edge. We had at least 3 different proposed methods for finding the edge of the barcode. We picked the one that was the most repeatable. Is that where the edge is? Nobody knows. If you sit down with, we used to have optical comparators, they probably still do in machine shops. And you take your part and mount it up and you get a 50-to-1 image of your part on this big screen. you can really see, particularly if it's a transparency like a barcode, you can really see those edges, but the edges are fuzzy. Where is the line between black and white? And two different operators, one will have the bars, the average bar is 0.5 mil narrower than person 2, than person 3, than person 4. So you have this subjective, where is the edge, which you eliminate by building a machine and declaring that where it finds the edge is the edge, just by definition. And so that's where this master barcode verifier got created.
Intermec at the time developed the first 2D symbology that was scannable. It's called Code 49, and it was the first, what is now called a stack symbology, which is basically rows of linear barcodes, and the laser scanner could only read lines. Nowadays, of course, a camera can read it just fine, but stack symbologies aren't really used anymore in new applications because you can use a matrix symbology, which uses much less space and can have more error correction and all that. But at the time, laser scanners were still a big thing, and in fact, this was before imagers were even on the drawing board. And David Allais invented this wacky thing called Code 49, and I was fortunate enough to be there and contributed my ideas, and as did many other engineers at Intermec at the time. And it was introduced at Scantech and made a big splash. And this guy came up to me and said, "Oh my God, that must be what I'm going to need to mark honeybees."
What is the most unusual or surprising use case for AIDC that you've come across that you're allowed to share?
Okay, so I thought about this a little bit, and I've come across a lot of them.
Thanks for watching. Please remember to subscribe, like, and we hope to see you next time on the Automatic Identification Teachers Institute Virtual Edition.